Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's early for our Mike and Bill, who are from California, but I'm reasonable time. It's roughly after 9 o'clock, and Mike has graced the uh, airways with us today to talk about legal issues for our module for this group. This is VSIG group number L, or legal module. So I'd like to welcome Mike, and if you can introduce themselves, and you'll plunge right into it. Our module today, the legal issues. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Glenn. Yes, I'm Mike Rodenbaugh. I run a small law firm out of California, now out of San Juan, Puerto Rico, called Rodenbaugh Law. I have been a domain name and trademark lawyer since the late 90s when I came out of law school. I was handling online trademark enforcement for the Golden Globe Awards in the late 90s. Then I moved to Yahoo, where I was trademark counsel for 7 years until 2007 when I started my own law firm. I've also been very active in ICANN since 2004. I think was my first meeting. I was probably active online and working groups a little bit before then, back when the UDRP was new. And I have been representing the business constituency on the GNSO Council for a while, and now currently I am in the intellectual property constituency, where I participate in policy development at ICANN. So I think that's enough of the background, and we want to get into the module itself. I think we're going to start talking about international laws that govern the internet. And that's a fairly easy question because I don't believe there really is international law that specifically governs the internet. I know there's often talk of doing something, but well, the way the world is today, new treaties are not very likely to happen ever, it seems. But we do have a couple of older treaties that have an impact on the internet. One of which is probably the most important one of which is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is something that was drafted by the UN, I believe in 1948. And in recent years, in particular, say the last 5 to 10 years around ICANN, certain groups, governments have been relying on principles within that treaty to push certain policies within ICANN, in particular around a right to privacy, as that relates to the domain registration information, which we used to call WHOIS information. People say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, at least by implication, includes a right to privacy, and that should have an impact around ICANN. There's also international treaties around. I don't know if they're really treaties as opposed to really agreements amongst law enforcement, but certainly the issue of child sexual abuse material is one that gets a lot of international participation, even if there isn't so-called international law governing that. Certainly, every country, pretty much every country, does have laws about that, and that's really become a paradigm model for cooperation on the internet in amongst governments and law enforcement entities, which do work together to try to keep that sort of thing off of the internet as well as possible. But um, as far as, and so that's clearly one of the legal challenges for legal enforcement in cyberspace. All sorts of bad content on the internet, of course. CSAM being probably the worst and the one that gets the most law enforcement attention, but we're certainly seeing it in other areas around, well, pharmaceuticals being sold across state lines, other sort of drugs, money laundering, things like that, where law enforcement agencies are certainly working together to try to address those problems. If not through formal international law, then at least through cross-jurisdictional cooperation and through, of course, national laws, which would apply to people within each country. Any questions on that part so far?
I muted myself, sorry. Okay, you mentioned about the international cooperation for the obvious the horrible abuse images of children or video streaming of ch abuse of children. How does the international community have any control or ability to govern the dark web? So the normal web, they have the ways and means of shutting those down, but when it's something that is slippery as the dark web, how do they manage to do that?
Well, I think we've learned in recent years that the dark web is not really providing a whole lot more cover to criminals than the open web. I mean, certainly there are a few extra layers of secrecy, I guess, if you will, but
Hmm.
law enforcement agencies have shown, I think, pretty clearly and loudly in certain cases, certainly around the Silk Road online drug marketplace, um, in particular, is one very public example where the law enforcement agencies have figured out how to infiltrate the dark web and how to make arrests. So I think in the early days of the so-called dark web, it was tougher. It took law enforcement a little bit of time to catch up, but I think from where I sit, at least today, and knowing quite a few people in online law enforcement,
Hmm.
um, they certainly know how to get onto the dark web and how to conduct all of their various investigative techniques within the dark web almost as well as they can do in the open web.
Probably ought to give a quick definition for the students of what the dark web is.
Sure. Well, you could probably give a better definition than I can, but I'll give it a try, and then you can certainly correct me or supplement my answer. But basically, the dark web is um, it's part of the internet, but it is only accessed through a special browser. Through
Hmm.
Tor is the most common one.
Hmm.
Um, and that provides a level of anonymity when you access websites within that segment of the internet, essentially.
So you did recently, President Trump, uh, due to his, I guess, obligations to the libertarians, decided to free the main founder, Ross Ulbricht. So I guess that becomes a whole issue of, you have these laws in place to punish those, such as those using the dark web, or in this case the Silk Road, to use it as a pathway for illegal commerce. But then you have an individual who has the powers to pardon a person. So I don't know, from a North American or American point of view, I guess it makes sense. But from outside of America, they probably are scratching their heads on that kind of action. So I don't know if other countries do pardons, but it seems like you have an infraction, a legal infraction. You have a law that says this is the punishment. You go through the judicial system. The person is thrown in jail for whatever length of time, and then like a passing of a magic wand, now they're out. So.
Yeah, a lot of people in America are scratching their heads about that also. I can assure you, it's something that is really unprecedented. I think the level of pardons that we saw last month from Trump. Um, And I mean, I could talk for a while about it, but I'd rather not.
Yeah.
Um, it's it's certainly an issue in our
Mm,
country, what
mm,
what the scope of the pardon power is, but it's essentially unlimited as far as anybody can tell. at this point, given what Biden did right before he left office as well. He issued quite a few pardons, including to his family. Um, so yeah, that's an issue that's going forward is going to get litigated presumably at some point. But for now,
That's that's a whole other story.
yeah. It doesn't have much to do with the internet specifically.
Okay.
Mm, mm.
Hopping back on topic,
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. Thank you. The voice of sanity has come in. Bill, were you going to say something?
no,
Oh,
I'm
okay.
speechless at the thought of me being the voice of sanity.
Okay.
Mm. Um, I was going to mention one other international law that doesn't necessarily govern the internet, but it does have an impact on what we do at ICANN, and in particular, and that would be the Madrid Treaty on Trademarks, which is quite a successful treaty, I would say. It's going on 100 years, I believe, and it does have some impact with our new top level domains in ICANN, insofar as we have a trademark clearinghouse and sunrise periods where trademark holders can come in and register domain names in advance of other stakeholders, because of their trademark rights, which are typically protected under the Madrid Treaty or the Madrid Protocol. So that does have some impact. While it's not a law, I would also mention that the Uniform Domain Domain Name Dispute Resolution Policy, or the UDRP, is effectively a law insofar as it is written into all GTLD domain name registration agreements.
Mhm.
Essentially, when you register a domain name, a GTLD domain name at least, and it has been applied across well over 100 country code TLDs at this point as well. You agree to this administrative quasi arbitration procedure, whereby if a trademark owner feels you have registered a domain name that is confusingly similar to their trademark, and you do not have a legitimate interest in that domain name and have registered and used it in bad faith, then a UDRB panelist can essentially take that domain name away from you upon complaint of the trademark owner. And so that is a dispute resolution policy that is being used approximately 3,000 or more times per year in recent years. And so certainly any trademark lawyer or domain name lawyer or internet lawyer will need to be familiar with that policy and how it works.
It's interesting you mentioned trademarks. Um, I did trade missions in China in the 90s, and it was at a time when there was still Chinese-made, very inferior products and joint ventures with companies like Adidas and different companies, and you could really see the difference in quality. Even the Chinese. A consumer was not buying the Chinese product. But it was interesting because we were representing a bunch of environmental companies and environmental technologies at the time, and we we were at a factory which had a joint venture with an American manufacturer, but the guy I was with, my translator, basically observed they were making different products, but exact same product would go off the line when the factory closed at say 5 or 6 o'clock, and then another sticker goes on the product with which was you know exact same product, but it was now known as you know this Chinese name product. So it was an interesting thing. I think things have moved along in China to recognize trademarks, but it was clearly a historical problem in China for a long time. So are they on in the same? Are they recognizing international internet-based domain names and trademarks now, or are we still having a problem with the historical problem of them ignoring it?
Well, I would say China has come a long way. it's particularly in the past 10 or 15 years. But it's still certainly a problem. We call it trademark piracy, cyber squatting. These things do tend to happen more out of China than out of just about anywhere else.
Okay.
On the other hand, of course, China has more people than anywhere
I know
else
it. Yep.
except India, to be fair. Um, it's obviously it's just a completely different culture from Western culture, and certainly counterfeiting is not seen as such a problem as it might be seen in Western countries if you're within China. But the government, at least, you know, from their public statements, and I think most brand attorneys that work with big brands that tend to be counterfeited, I think they would say that China has come a long way to combat these things and has made changes to their law, to their trademark laws and unfair competition laws, in particular in recent years, that are designed to assist brand owners in alleviating these problems much easier than we've been able to do in the past. So it's getting better, but it still is a haven for trademark cyber squatting and counterfeiting as compared to most other countries.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So I guess we could move to the next topic around national legislation and what sorts of national legislation apply to the internet. Um, And that one is tricky because a lot of, I mean, I've come at it from the US point of view, of course. I'm a US lawyer. I don't pretend to particularly know much law outside of the US. So I'll focus there. And we've got all sorts of national legislation and, of course, state by state legislation within the United States that is designed to deal with certain ills on the internet. Um, in recent years, the fads amongst some of the state governments are to try to require age verification, for example, to look at adult materials on the internet, um, laws designed to restrict social media platforms' ability to take down content that the platforms think is objectionable, but the posters think is not. Um, so those laws are winding their way through the courts. They're all invariably challenged, often by a organization called Net Choice out of Washington D.C. They're bringing a lot of litigation to try to stop these sorts of laws from going into effect, because the argument is that those laws abridge our First Amendment right to free speech. Um, in America, it's a wonderful thing. Corporations have a right to free speech, and so the argument goes that should social media's platforms be able to censor other people's speech, or is it the platform's right of free speech to control what they publish? So it's very, very interesting questions that have yet to be addressed by our Supreme Court, but certainly will be getting there in the next couple of years, most likely. Um, Also now seeing a flurry of activity designed to prohibit deepfakes, which has become a very serious problem. Um, it became very public. Uh, it became an issue of much public notoriety last year with Taylor Swift having some incidents of her being deep faked into pornography videos. And so at that point, a lot of states began to draft laws to outlaw that sort of a thing. I believe we just had the first state actually pass one of those laws within the last couple of weeks. And I'm blanking on which one it was, but those kinds of laws are going to be happening, coming out more and more from the states. Um, as far as national legislation, um, well, back to the on the trademark side, cyber squatting side, we have what's called the Anti-Cyber Squatting Consumer Protection Act. in the US. I believe that that is a fairly unique law to the United States, that there really is not any sort of similar law in any other country. And it's very similar to the UDRP that I mentioned earlier, except that it is a somewhat lesser standard to prove bad faith under the ACPA. And um, under our federal trademark laws, you have the ability to obtain damages and potentially attorney's fees. In fact, this statute provides for statutory damages, meaning you don't actually have to prove an amount of damage. A judge can simply award you
Hmm.
damages of between $1,000 to $100,000 per infringing domain name. So this is a law that has been used by um, mostly bigger brands to go after many infringing domain names at once. Whereas under the UDRP, you can typically only go after one person at a time. Under the ACPA, it's possible under some of our case law that you can actually go after many different infringers at once and solve a bunch of your cyber squatting problems that way rather than filing multiple UDRP actions. It's a law that's not really used a ton in America, but certainly if you're a trademark lawyer, or again, an internet lawyer, you ought to be aware of it because the penalties are fairly steep and some fairly large judgments have been awarded, including attorney's fees under that law. Um, Other specific laws applying to the internet. Hmm. Well, we did have, I think net neutrality probably deserves a shout out. We had some, I don't know that it was a law, but it was an executive order from, I think it goes back to Obama as to net neutrality, meaning essentially that the internet service providers could not give special advantages to people that are paying more to speed up their traffic. So, for example, I'll just use an example. I don't know if it's true or not, but Netflix may want to have speedier access to Verizon's fiber network because they've got, it's Netflix. They're streaming movies all over the world, and they feel like they need to have a faster access than you or I need from our home. Um, until the Trump administration last month withdrew that executive order, and so it remains to be seen what will happen next. Whether or not certain ISPs in America are now able to essentially throttle traffic that they think is less valuable and sell speedier access to companies that can afford it. We'll see how that plays out here in the next few years.
Um, you brought up a couple of interesting things about net neutrality, but because the United States have rolled out a program throughout many of the states or all the states and tribal lands, internet access, so internet for all concept. So there was a case I recall. There's a group called NDIA. It's a digital access group that's based in Cleveland, and they did a really good paper, I recall, on the redlining by AT&T. So what they did is they rolled out internet access with this subsidized internet, and what they did is in poorer areas, particularly poorer Black areas in Cleveland, they didn't get the speeds that they were promised or access. So it becomes a human rights issue, right? In terms of people having fair access as students or fair access because they're poor. But there was definitely a reduced speed. Data was reduced substantially. So have you heard of that kind of case of whether it's access for all or other situations?
I have heard of these sorts of issues for sure. Yes. Lots of people have complained over many years that their speeds are throttled by their ISP and they shouldn't be. The ISPs, of course, come back with, well, we need to be able to manage our networks And so part of that is throttling people's speed so that everybody has access on the network, is their argument. Whether it's true or not, nobody ever knows unless there's a lawsuit and there's a lot of discovery and it's very expensive.
Mm,
So, you or I don't really have the ability to go and sue Verizon or AT&T on this sort of thing because they've got teams of lawyers that will bury you in paper and cost. So that's why we were relying on the government to maintain these rules around neutrality. Essentially, the notion that the networks are public utilities, but that's a rather liberal or progressive view of things. And now that we have a conservative government in place, um, those rules are gone, and we'll see what happens in the marketplace with this issue.
Hmm. Now that begs the question, and because I'm non-American, I'm sort of seeing things from a different set of eyes. And welcome, Esther. Esther has joined us as well. I've asked her which country she's coming in from. What about Project 2025? Is that something in terms of changes in what we've seen some kind of manifest destiny concepts where taking back things that the and changing names of different bodies of water and stuff. Is there anything from a legal point of view, maybe overturning Diana? Mind you, ICANN is based in California. Is there anything from a legal point of view? Do you think this conservative government in Washington will actually start to put the screws to different things, or what is it a good time for business in America from the legislative approach they're taking? What do you think on that one?
Well, I mean, Project 2025 is certainly not legislation yet, but
Right.
it was designed as a roadmap for the conservatives as to what they're intending to do if they were to get power, which now, of course, they have achieved. Um, And as far as I don't pretend to know what's in Project 2025. It's not a document that I was particularly interested in reading. Perhaps I should at this point, but I know it's 800 pages or something.
Yeah.
Um, but that's, it's one thing to put your plans on paper like that. It's another thing to actually pass a law through our Congress, which has become in recent years, decade, it's become almost impossible. So I'm not really, even though they're in power, they don't have a strong enough majority in the Senate to pass legislation, and they have an extremely narrow majority in the House of Representatives. So it makes it very difficult for them to do anything. Um, so it's not something that most people worry too much about,
Okay.
because again, they want to do things, but so far they're hampered through the legislative process, and instead what we're seeing is lots of executive orders. We're seeing essentially a power grab from the executive over the legislative branch in our country right now, and it's a big thing. It's a very worrisome thing that a lot of people are paying attention to and trying to figure out how to counteract what's been going on in this past month.
Yeah, if I
Good.
can toss in something, uh, Glenn mentioned the fact that ICANN is incorporated in California, and that's certainly had an impact. We had a case of the company that runs the .org top level domain um, being potentially bought out by someone else, and the California State Attorney General got involved because ICANN's a California corporation to influence what actually happened there. But to drag things back to the impact of national laws outside the U.S., sometimes things happen simply because it's a hassle to write software that works differently in different markets. And if a market that's big enough says, this is what you've got to do, it's sometimes easier to just do that, even though the rest of the world isn't requiring it. The case that jumps to mind is the European Union's GDPR, and I've forgotten what the
Yep.
acronym stands for, but it's basically a privacy legislation on who's registering domain names. And the EU is the only one who's passed it, but software companies have basically decided, all right, we're going to rewrite our software to take care of that. And it happens for the whole world. Even ICANN, the who is function, which allowed you to look at registration information, is basically being, I guess, phased out so as to not leave ICANN vulnerable to sanctions from the EU. And they're trying to write something that will conform to GDPR while still providing some of the information. So national
Yeah.
laws don't necessarily apply everywhere, but they proliferate. They get extended around the world if the nation involved is big enough as a market.
Yeah,
That's
no,
enough for
that's
me.
actually that's a great example. The GDPR, which is the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, I believe is the acronym, something like that. But it applies much more broadly than just to the who is. That applies to any transfer of data across national borders, and it's a very stringent law with very huge penalties possible under that law. And so what we saw when that law was implemented is that the entire domain name industry, or registries and registrars, even if they don't have any business activity in the EU, still were essentially taking steps to hide their who is information because of the GDPR. They're using that essentially as a cover to do something that they wanted to do for a long time, which is essentially maintain control of that information for themselves. And so GDPR essentially, indirectly caused who is to go pretty dark. Ever since that law was passed, it's very hard to find a who is record anymore that actually has correct information about who is behind a domain name, for better or for worse, depending on your perspective. But that's clearly has happened, and California has passed also a similar law to the GDPR on a
Yep.
statewide basis.
Yep.
And as you say, we're just California, but we are such a big economy and so important to the internet that our law becomes a de facto standard across the country. So any website doing business in America essentially has to comply with California law on that point and any others.
Um, I would like to welcome Esther. She's coming in from Kenya. Esther, don't hesitate to chime in if you have a question, particularly that's relevant to your country and what's happening in Africa. But since I mentioned Africa, a couple of years ago, there was a pretty big contentious issue with the RAR, which was Afrinic, and the whole issue of the number of the IPv4 issues. And one company from China actually secured virtually millions of these unused. Um, so they it was a real big issue. Is that something that I don't think it's an issue in North America, but what's your opinion on that?
I'm not super familiar with it. I do have a general awareness that IP4 addresses are very scarce and that in certain underdeveloped regions of the world, they seem to have a surplus of these IP4 addresses, which have a lot of value. And so people have tried to figure out how to wrest them away
Yeah.
from those nations and put them to use or to sale to people who want to buy these assets. My opinion on it is I don't really know that much
Um,
about it, but in general, the reason that these IP4 addresses were allocated to underserved regions was so that they would be able to have capacity to build. And so if we take away these fundamental assets from them, then that's going to hamper that ability.
sure. Yeah, because ICANN has been making with this next round of new GTLDs is they're looking at subsidizing the adoption of local new GTLDs. I'm not sure on the amount of subsidy. You or Bill, do you guys know how much of an incentive they're giving for people to jump into the game?
I do.
Oh, okay.
It's what's called the applicant support program, and
Oh, okay.
it's actually live since November, and we'll be accepting applications through this November for the next round of GTLDs, which is expected. The application window is expected to open in April 2026. If you qualify for the ASP applicant support program, um, and that it's basically meant for small businesses from underserved regions, for NGOs or IGOs, that sort of thing. It's not, certainly not for large for-profit companies. So it's not going to be easy to qualify, I believe. It's a bit of a process. Of course, anything you do with ICANN is a bit of a process. But if you do manage to satisfy all their criteria, then you'll be getting a 70 to 80% discount on the
Wow.
application fee, which is currently 220, currently is going to be set at $227,000 per application. So it's a significant financial benefit on the application fee. Also opens you up to various pro bono service providers who've opted in to participate and assist ASP applicants with their applications, because an application for a new TLD is quite a process again with ICANN. It
Mm,
requires consultants, lawyers, a back-end registry provider to complete the technical sections of the evaluation, all of this. So it's something that you that mo pretty much any small business from an underserved region is going to have no idea how to do it, and they're going to need help. And so ICANN, to its credit, has built this program and has built a network of pro bono service providers to try to get underserved regions to participate much more in this round of TLDs than they were able to participate in the last round, which is now 12 years ago, 13 years ago,
hmm hmm
2012 was that application window.
Yeah, I remember reading the report by I think Robert Guerrera. Um, I think Robert Guerrera was involved with it. Um, but they reported particularly two regions, Latin America and Africa in particular, had the lowest uptick in purchasing the new GTLD program, like you said, 12, 13 years ago. So this is impressive that the price is substantially less, but also the mentoring. So I guess they're looking at existing like VeriSign or different companies to step up and mentor the applications. Is that how you see it working?
Not so much mentoring, but providing services free of charge.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I signed up, so I'll take one or two, whatever capacity I have to help one or two businesses through the process. Because I'm small, I'm one guy. There's other bigger law firms that will be able to take on
Yeah.
more pro bono projects. So I know ICANN has created a list somewhere of these service providers. I think on the applicant support portal, you could probably find it. Um, but yeah, that is the plan, and I expect that more people will join as the application window gets closer.
Do they have any idea how many people will be jumping on this? Is it huge numbers or I guess they don't know, right?
No, I mean, anybody can just speculate. The last time in 2012, people were speculating there'd be anywhere from 100 to 10,000 applications, and there ended up being about 2,000 applications, and we put in another 1,200 top level domains to the root at that point. Some people think it's going to be more or less the same this time, maybe
Hmm,
2,000 applications, but it's anybody's guess,
right.
really.
Yeah, well, it was basically a lot of companies jumped into it, but they never used they sort of they got their domain name, and I off the top of my head I can't remember companies that did that. Maybe you guys remember, but they secured it, but they never used it, so they just let it go. So
Well,
um
that did happen. So there was about 600 dot brand TLDs, we call those. So,
yeah.
dot Yahoo, dot Google, whatever, dot Amazon. And yeah, I think a couple hundred of those brands have simply given up their contracts and turned them back in. But a lot of the brands have made active use of their domains. HSBC is one of the prime examples. They really do use .hsbc, .fox, .sky. There are some very good use cases for .brand TLDs, but we also saw big companies that people, I don't think anybody expected. Amazon and Google in particular came in 2012 and got, between 50, I think Amazon was 70 TLDs. And even 10 years later, they've only put a couple of those generic TLDs to use. So people are concerned that there was sort of some warehousing going on there in those companies. It's hard to argue that it isn't because, what the heck have they been doing for 10 years with these very good, theoretically very good, valuable top level domains in the generic space, having nothing to do with their brand.
Well, that could be protection too, right? They wanted to secure that space so someone else wouldn't go after it, perhaps.
Yeah, that's probably was part of it at the time. But I mean, heck, after 10 years, you're paying ICANN every year for each one of these names. But, of course, Amazon, it's just a rounding error in somebody's budget, but still. Um, I do hear a lot of criticism, from various parts of the community that these TLDs have essentially just been stockpiled and and buried
Hmm.
by large companies.
I think the other big unknown trying to figure out how many TLDs will get registered is nobody knows how enthusiastically people who use non-Latin scripts will go after getting top-level domains in their own languages. Um, could be huge. Could be people figure, well, English is still the default international language, so if you want to sell worldwide, you probably stick with that. But if your focus is more narrow, having something in Arabic or something in Chinese could be attractive, and nobody knows even vaguely what that's liable to do.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I mean that's IDNs, we call those international domain names, and IDN TLDs is certainly something that ICANN wants to encourage more of.
Hmm.
I think part of that is just guilt that it's taken ICANN so long to
It
make
did.
these
Yeah.
things operable, um, that effectively the world has kind of moved on. In China, they've just simply learned how to use .com and .org and .net,
Yeah.
.cn, and so the Chinese language top level domains have not really gained much traction, even though there are a bunch of them from the 2012 round. I think the statistics are extremely distressing about the usage of IDN domain names. It's just a very small fraction of the overall DNS. And, while ICANN would like to build it up, some would say that, that train has left the station and people just aren't particularly interested in them because there's problems with universal acceptance of those names still. They just don't work for email in many cases, for example. So IDNs is a tough one. It's one, like, in theory, we would all like to see more. People should be able to communicate in their own language, but in practice, the internet's now, 30 years old, the public internet, and nobody's using the technology that has been made available with respect to IDNs.
So, are we on target of what topics you wanted to say, Mike, or did we leave something out?
I think we got a little bit away from law and into ICANN regulation, but that's okay. I think that's
Hmm.
important for people to understand that ICANN is not a legislative body. It does not pass laws, but it does develop policy that applies to the global domain name system. And so everything from how you transfer a domain name from one person to another, the qualifications to register a domain name, what information is published, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is essentially devised by ICANN consensus policy and the ICANN board, and then applied to every domain name registration across the world, every GTLD domain name registration across the world. And then in practice, most country code TLDs typically adopt very similar practices once we come to consensus on the generic side. Um, I suppose it's also important to mention the technical underpinnings of the DNS. And again, this is not a legislative body, but it's a very important body called the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF. And they have essentially created what's called RFCs, which are essentially laws of the building blocks of the internet, how actual components of the DNS are supposed to work together, providing technical standards that all developers can use uniformly across the world to make sure that the internet remains interoperable for everybody. So the IETF RFC is a very important body of rules that most internet lawyers should at least have some familiarity with.
I'd like to just jump in on that since you mentioned IETF. IETF is like ICANN. They do 3 meetings a year, international. Um, if you're interested in getting involved with IETF, they do have fellowships. And second of all, you can join the meetings remotely, and which they'll no charge if you request gratis admission. So I attend a lot of the meetings remotely. I'm particularly involved with the whole issue, the environmental impact of the internet. So I'm directly and indirectly involved with that. So that's important. If you get involved with the IETF, really look at what the subcommittees are and how you can get involved. To write an RFC, that's a pretty high level of talent and technical knowledge, but it is might be up your alley, folks. You definitely can't, if you're interested in internet issues, you really need to get involved with your local chapter of ISOC, which used to oversee the IETF, but IETF spun off as a separate entity about 4 or 5 years ago. When I was on the board of ISOC, we actually moved IETF to its own entity. So they're working around the world, working on the standards. Very, very important group to be involved with.
Very true. And much of what you said as far as access to those meetings also applies in ICANN in the policy development world. The meetings are free. There are 3 of them a year in person, but all sessions are available for remote participation. And they will also offer fellowships. Um, and it's a very good way to get involved with international internet law by essentially getting involved in ICANN in one of the constituencies. Typically it would be there's a whole bunch of different constituencies you can get involved with at ICANN. There's the at-large advisory committee. There's a non-commercial stakeholder group. If you're a business side or an IP lawyer, there's a constituency for you in the GNSO. The ISPs have their own constituency in the GNSO. And basically all of these stakeholders get together in various working groups and develop policies that are then going to be applied across all GTLD domain name registration agreements.
Bill actually, he's not now, but he has been for the last few years an ALAC member on policy, giving policy comments back to ICANN from the end user community. Bill, you want to comment on your experience with ALAC? I think
Yeah,
he's,
there we
here.
go. Sorry,
Yeah.
had trouble getting to the mute button. Yeah, ALAC has the obviously impossible task of trying to represent all of the end users of the internet, which is essentially every human being on almost every human being on Earth at this point, whether they know it or not. And obviously, we're doing that is impossible because we can't even talk to any significant fraction. So we're reduced to best effort, basically, to represent the interests of the end users. But that said, the more and more different people that we can get involved, the better. We don't want it to be primarily old white guys from North America, which has a tendency to be a unreasonably large fraction of the participation. And we've been doing better, especially with people from the Asia Pacific region and from Europe, but we're desperately short, I would say, of people from Africa and rather short of people from Latin America as well. So there's anyone from those areas who's willing to put in a little time and effort can have a huge positive impact. So if you try a couple of the going to the ICANN meetings online and check it out, and if that's interesting, the more you get involved, I would say the better for everyone.
No, it's very true. I mean, in the ICANN policy development space, you have to remember that half of it on the GTLD policy side is controlled by domain registries and registrars who have their business interests at stake, and so have the large ones have full-time employees devoted to ICANN policy work, whereas the rest of us, representing the rest of the world, we don't. Nobody has full-time people lobbying ICANN if their business doesn't depend on ICANN. And yet, of course, the policies that are developed out of ICANN and applied to the world affect everybody else. And in many cases, much more than they even affect the contracted parties. But it's a common criticism of ICANN that essentially the policy development function is captured by people by the parties that have the biggest financial stake in the game. Like the people whose business depends on their contracts with ICANN. And so, yeah, the more people that we can get involved from outside the industry, the better. But it's a heavy lift to get engaged in ICANN. There's just learning the language, the vocabulary, the acronyms can take a while. But it's not for the faint of heart. It's certainly there are people that are happy to help and shepherd and mentor new people who have the energy and the ability to participate.
Great, thank you. That's a good invitation for folks listening to this session to actively involve and reach out to Bill, myself, through the discussion thread. We're more than happy to direct you to people. We actually, because we've been involved with ICANN for quite a while, we do know a significant number of people, and some of them could be in your backyard. They could be involved with wherever you're coming in to listen to this session. So I'd like to conclude and I just wanted to give you the final word, Mike, to come in and sort of put a bow on this ribbon.
Okay, well, I think, in a nutshell, there's not a whole lot of international law that applies to the internet, but there's a lot of underpinning, consensus policy and regulation through ICANN and the IETF that is really important to understand. And then, of course, each country, all countries have their own interests and their own laws, and how they interact with one another is a fascinating aspect of being an internet lawyer, put it that way.
Okay, excellent, excellent. I gave you access to the course material. If there's something that you can suggest that we add as content, or I can think an introductory guide would not be a bad idea. Perhaps we can find some volunteers one day. Bill, any final comments?
Nope. The only thing I would say is there are, we mentioned the IETF very briefly in addition, but we spent a lot of time on ICANN, and there are other organizations involved in governing the internet. I'm not sure how much impact they have on legal issues, but just wanted to hammer on the point that we don't want to, if you're interested in how the internet is run, you don't want to get too narrowly focused too early. Once you get involved, simple time constraints will keep you from getting involved in everything. Glenn comes close, God knows how, but normal human beings, about one, maybe two of the internet governing groups is probably about all you can manage.
Yeah, I don't sleep, so that explains. But I have a really eclectic interest. It goes back to when we were investors in Green. That didn't achieve very much, but we put our money where our mouth is. So Green was a great concept. When we got the last round, we managed to get it, but you know what? You can have all the brains and money, but it doesn't necessarily work. So, yeah, well, I have the T-shirt, guys. So it's but we've been very fortunate because of our network to have phenomenal speakers. And Mike, this is really, really important. And I know we didn't have a great audience today. We have some internet issues with some of our participants. And thank you, Esther, for joining us from Kenya. But this will be shared with the rest of the group, and all the recordings. There's roughly 250 recordings, and and you mentioned Steve or Net Choice. Steve has been one of our speakers before from Net Choice and others. This is a very, very important topic, and I think you did. Considering you narrowed it down to three major topics, I think you did a great job.
I appreciate it, Glenn. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm certainly always available to chat, and for any follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer.
Great. Okay, well, folks, that concludes our call today. Thanks again. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Esther, for joining us. And the recording will be posted sometime today. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike.